In the late 1932, as clouds gathered over the Pacific, Imperial Japan revealed an aircraft that seemed to belong to the future. It was lean where others were heavy, graceful where rivals relied on brute force. Built for speed and range, it could fly farther, climb faster, and turn tighter than anything likely to oppose it. To foreign observers, it appeared almost impossible, a machine that defied the accepted limits of fighter design. In Tokyo, it was hailed not merely as an airplane, but as a solution. The belief behind it was clear and widely shared. Japanese planners assumed the next war would be decided quickly, in a violent opening act that shattered enemy fleets and morale alike. Victory would come early, before industrial weight could be brought to bear. In such a war, endurance mattered less than initiative. The aircraft, soon known as the A6M0, was engineered for that vision: maximum performance at the moment of first contact. Protection was treated as an indulgence, not a necessity. On paper, the logic seemed unassailable. By stripping weight wherever possible, designers achieved astonishing range and maneuverability. The Zero could escort bombers across distances other nations considered unreachable. It could outturn any fighter it encountered. Test pilots marveled at its responsiveness, describing an aircraft that felt almost alive beneath their hands. Yet embedded in that brilliance was a quiet omission: armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural redundancy had all been sacrificed in the pursuit of perfection. Doctrine reinforced the decision. Japanese naval aviation prized aggression, skill, and the fighting spirit of the pilot above all else. The aircraft was an extension of that philosophy, a weapon that rewarded boldness and punished hesitation. Survivability, like retreat, was not emphasized. To be hit was to have failed. In this environment, the Zero's vulnerabilities were not ignored so much as accepted, even rationalized. Still, among those who flew it, unease took root. Pilots noticed how easily bullets passed through the wings during training exercises. Ground crews saw how thin the skin truly was when panels were removed. Minor damage that might have been shrugged off by other aircraft demanded careful repair. These were observations shared quietly, often dismissed just as quickly. To its enemies, the Zero would soon appear unstoppable, a terror of the early Pacific War. But to the men who strapped themselves inside its cockpit, admiration was tempered by awareness. They understood even then that they were riding something extraordinary and dangerously unforgiving. And as the aircraft prepared to meet the world, another truth waited beyond the horizon, because every advantage, once revealed, invites an answer. Between 1937 and 1940, as the aircraft moved from prototype to frontline service, Japanese command placed its faith not in metal, but in men. Doctrine held that superior training, discipline, and combat spirit would compensate for any material deficiency. A well-trained pilot, it was believed, would never be hit. In this thinking, light construction was not a flaw, it was an advantage, sharpening performance and rewarding skill. The aircraft did not need to endure punishment if its pilot never allowed the enemy the chance. Yet the early tests told a quieter, less obedient story. Ballistic trials showed how easily machine gun rounds penetrated the wings. Engineers noted fuel tanks that ignited rather than sealed, frames that bent instead of absorbing stress. These reports were filed, reviewed, and set aside. The aircraft met its performance targets, and performance was what doctrine demanded. To slow the program for survivability was to question the premise of the war itself. Here, experience was trusted more than engineering limits. Senior aviators, many veterans of China, argued that combat intuition outweighed structural concerns. They had survived before through skill and aggression, and they saw no reason that would change. To them, the aircraft was not fragile. It was honest. It demanded perfection and offered dominance in return. The idea that technology might impose an unavoidable boundary was quietly resisted. Designers felt the pressure acutely. Their role was not to challenge doctrine, but to serve it. Requests for armor plating or reinforced fuel systems were pared down or rejected outright. Each added kilogram threatened range, climb, and maneuverability, the very qualities the aircraft was built to embody. In conference rooms and factories, compromise always favored speed. Protection remained theoretical. Among the crews, doubt took a different form. Pilots began to give the aircraft nicknames, spoken softly, often with a smile that did not quite mask unease. Jokes circulated about one-hit machines and burning wings. Humor became a way to acknowledge what could not be openly challenged. They loved the aircraft for what it could do, and feared it for what it could not survive. By the time the Zero stood ready for war, the seeds of distrust were already planted, not loudly, not officially, but firmly. The doctrine remained intact, the reports archived, the aircraft unchanged. And soon, beyond the training fields and test ranges, reality would be given its first opportunity to speak back. In the opening months of the Pacific War, the aircraft fulfilled its promise with brutal clarity. From the skies over China to the first clashes with Western air power, it dominated encounters with alarming ease. Allied pilots found themselves outturned, outclimbed, and outranged by an enemy they scarcely understood. Formations broke apart. Bombers fell burning into the sea. Reports returned describing a fighter that seemed to defy physics, appearing where it should not have been, staying aloft longer than any rational calculation allowed. Foreign intelligence struggled to explain what it was seeing. Analysts assumed the performance must be exaggerated, or that such capability required hidden strength. Some believed the aircraft carried armor they had not yet detected. Others concluded that no machine so capable could also be fragile. The myth of invincibility spread faster than technical understanding, reinforced by defeat after defeat. To many Allied airmen, the aircraft became less a machine than a presence, something to be avoided rather than confronted. Yet inside its cockpit, a different truth pressed in. Japanese pilots, celebrated for their victories, felt the margin beneath them narrowing with every engagement. They knew that their advantage existed only so long as they remained untouched. When rounds found their mark, the outcome was swift and unforgiving. Fuel tanks ignited. Control surfaces vanished. There was little time between damage and disaster. Survival depended not on endurance, but on the hope that the enemy missed. Combat reports reflected this quiet tension. Pilots praised the aircraft's agility, even as they described comrades lost to single bursts of fire. Ground crews repaired machines riddled with holes that would have been inconsequential elsewhere. The aircraft's strengths were absolute, until the moment they were not. One bullet could erase speed, range, and maneuverability in an instant. The contrast was stark. Against opponents who lacked tactics or experience, the aircraft was devastating. Against accurate fire, it was exposed. Its brilliance demanded perfection, and war rarely provided it. Each victory reinforced confidence at the command level, while each loss confirmed what pilots already understood. In this way, success became a veil. Early dominance concealed structural failure, allowing triumph to speak louder than warning. The aircraft continued to terrify its enemies, even as it quietly unsettled those who relied upon it. And as the battles expanded and opponents began to learn, the question lingered: what would happen when the fear faded and accuracy took its place? Between 1940 and 1941, the philosophy hardened into doctrine. Speed was the armor. Japanese planners and engineers treated velocity and maneuverability not merely as advantages, but as substitutes for protection itself. If an aircraft could not be caught, it did not need to endure. If it could always dictate the terms of engagement, survivability became a secondary concern. This belief shaped every production decision that followed. The result was deliberate and uncompromising. The aircraft carried no armor plating to shield the pilot. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. These were not oversights or shortages, they were choices. Every added kilogram threatened climb rate, turning radius, and range. Protection was seen as a tax paid in performance, and performance was the currency of early victory. In design meetings, speed won every argument. There was irony embedded in the arithmetic. Each gain in agility, each kilometer of additional range, was purchased with a future cost that could not yet be measured. The aircraft became exceptional at avoiding damage, but catastrophically poor at absorbing it. What appeared efficient in peacetime calculations would prove unforgiving under sustained fire. The balance sheet favored the opening move, not the long campaign. For the crews, this risk was absorbed as duty. Pilots were trained to believe that survival rested in their hands alone. Discipline, awareness, and aggression were presented as sufficient defenses. To accept the aircraft was to accept its vulnerabilities without complaint. Many did so willingly, even proudly, convinced that skill would compensate where metal did not. To question the design was, in subtle ways, to question the mission. Yet skepticism persisted beneath the surface. Veteran pilots, especially those with combat experience beyond training exercises, understood the limits of perfection. They spoke quietly of near misses, of fragments that passed too close, of how thin the margin truly was. They did not doubt their abilities, but they doubted the assumption that war would always allow them to remain untouched. These doubts rarely traveled upward. Doctrine left little room for hesitation. As the aircraft entered widespread service, the world around it began to change. Opponents adapted, tactics evolved, firepower increased, speed and maneuverability remained formidable. But they were no longer singular. The battlefield grew less forgiving, less predictable. What had been designed for dominance in a brief, decisive war was now facing the early signs of attrition. In this way, the aircraft carried a quiet contradiction from the moment it took flight. It represented the pinnacle of one philosophy at the precise moment that philosophy was becoming insufficient. The weapon had not failed, but the world it was built for was already disappearing. And as the war pressed forward, the question was no longer how fast it could fly, but how long such speed could continue to be enough. Between 1941 and 1942, the aircraft's reputation reached its zenith. In the skies over the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, it dominated early Allied fighters with ruthless efficiency. Outmatched aircraft fell quickly, often without understanding what had struck them. For Japanese command, these victories appeared to confirm every assumption made during development. Speed had prevailed. Doctrine had been vindicated. The opening phase of the war unfolded exactly as planned. Success shaped interpretation. Losses, when they occurred, were framed as individual failures rather than structural ones. Pilots were said to have misjudged an engagement or lingered too long. The aircraft itself remained beyond reproach. This belief allowed command to preserve confidence without revisiting uncomfortable design choices. Victory spoke loudly, and warnings were easily drowned out. Yet beneath the surface, evidence accumulated. Maintenance crews recorded damage patterns that repeated with unsettling consistency. Minor hits produced catastrophic results. Fires spread rapidly. Aircraft returned riddled with holes that told a clear story to those trained to read them. These reports moved slowly through bureaucratic channels, stripped of urgency as they traveled upward. Each was weighed against the undeniable tally of victories, and each was found wanting. The struggle was not one of awareness, but of timing. The aircraft was winning now, and war rewards the present. To acknowledge fragility in the midst of success risked undermining morale and momentum. So the warnings remained quiet, confined to technical memoranda and private conversations. The design stayed the same. The assumption held. Then the balance began to shift. Allied engineers and tacticians studied wreckage, listened to pilot accounts, and adapted. New tactics emphasized teamwork, diving attacks, and firepower over turning contests. New aircraft arrived with heavier armament and better protection. Encounters grew less one-sided. The Zero still excelled, but its margin narrowed with each engagement. By late 1942, the pattern could no longer be dismissed. Losses increased, even as pilot quality remained high. Aircraft that once returned damaged no longer did. Survivability, not performance, emerged as the decisive factor. The early victories, so convincing in their moment, had delayed recognition of a fundamental flaw. In retrospect, the warnings had been present all along, embedded in every repair log and after-action report. They had simply been overshadowed by triumph. The aircraft had delivered exactly what it promised, but only for a time. And as the war entered a new phase, the question shifted from how the Zero would dominate to whether it could endure a conflict that no longer played to its strengths. By mid-1942, the belief system that had shaped the aircraft remained largely intact. Doctrine resisted revision, even as circumstances changed around it. The fighter was still treated as fundamentally sound, its shortcomings attributed to the evolving chaos of war rather than to design. To alter it now, many feared, would be to admit that the opening assumptions had been flawed. And so the aircraft continued into combat largely unchanged, carrying with it an earlier vision of how the war was supposed to unfold. The shock arrived in numbers. Casualty rates began to climb with unsettling speed. Squadrons that once returned nearly intact now came back thinned, or not at all. Losses were no longer isolated or easily explained away. They appeared across multiple theaters, against different opponents, under varying conditions. The pattern was unmistakable, even if its cause was still resisted. Something fundamental had shifted. There was deep irony in the moment. The aircraft could still win dogfights. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it remained lethal, agile, and precise. But wars are not decided by isolated victories. They are decided by endurance. The fighter excelled in moments, not in attrition. Each engagement demanded perfection, and each imperfection carried a fatal cost. What had once been an advantage now imposed a relentless tax on survival. For the crews, this reality became inescapable. Pilots flew, knowing that a single hit, often a single bullet, could be the end. There was no margin, no second chance built into the machine. Courage remained, but it was increasingly paired with resignation. Combat reports spoke less of confidence and more of inevitability. Skill could still delay fate, but it could not always prevent it. The turning point came as enemy firepower intensified. Allied aircraft arrived with heavier armament, tighter formations, and tactics designed specifically to exploit the fighter's weaknesses. They no longer chased turning contests. They attacked from altitude, struck once, and disengaged. The sky grew hostile in ways it had not been before. Speed alone could no longer guarantee escape. As losses mounted, confidence quietly collapsed. Not in dramatic pronouncements, but in the subtle erosion of belief. Pilots questioned whether experience was enough. Commanders began to acknowledge what could no longer be denied. The aircraft had been designed to feel untouchable, but war had found a way to touch it. The cost of that early invincibility was now fully visible. The fighter had shaped the opening of the war, but it could not shape its outcome. Its strengths remained real, but they were no longer decisive. And as the balance tipped further, Japan faced a realization it had long delayed, because somewhere beyond the front lines, the enemy was already building machines designed not just to compete, but to survive. Between 1942 and 1943, flying the aircraft became an exercise in avoidance rather than endurance. Crews adapted not because doctrine had changed, but because reality demanded it. Survival now depended on never being touched at all. Pilots learned to think in margins measured by seconds and meters, shaping every maneuver around the single imperative of evasion. Combat was no longer entered casually. Every engagement carried an unspoken calculation. Not how to win, but how to leave. Out of this pressure came tactical adaptation. Hit-and-run combat became not merely preferred, but necessary. Pilots struck quickly from advantage, firing short bursts before disengaging at speed. Prolonged turning fights, the very contests the aircraft had once dominated, were avoided whenever possible. Experience taught that lingering invited return fire, and return fire was rarely survivable. The sky became a place of fleeting contact, rather than sustained battle. Here lay the central irony of the period. Skill was now being asked to replace engineering. Where armor and redundancy might once have absorbed error, only precision remained. Veteran pilots carried an increasing burden, knowing that their judgment was the last and only layer of protection. Training emphasized anticipation and restraint as much as aggression. To survive was to fly perfectly, repeatedly, without exception. The pressure was relentless. Fatigue mattered more. Distraction mattered more. A single misjudged turn, a momentary lapse in awareness, could end a career or a life instantly. There was no buffer against chance. Crews flew knowing that they were one mistake away from catastrophe, and that no amount of courage could negotiate with physics. Combat did not forgive repetition. It punished exposure. As the war progressed, survivability ceased to be an abstract concept discussed in design rooms and reports. It became immediate and personal. Pilots watched friends vanish after taking hits that would have been survivable in other aircraft. Wreckage confirmed what experience already suggested. Structural lightness, once a strength, now defined the margin of loss. The aircraft did exactly what it had been built to do, and nothing more. This reality reshaped behavior. Missions were approached with heightened caution. Formations tightened not for offense, but for mutual warning. Pilots scanned constantly, not just for enemies, but for escape routes. Every flight carried the weight of previous losses. Confidence did not disappear, but it narrowed, focused entirely on execution rather than belief. Faith in doctrine had been replaced by reliance on habit and instinct. Fear, though rarely spoken of, became inseparable from flight. Not panic, but awareness. a steady recognition of vulnerability that followed pilots into the cockpit and lingered long after landing. It sharpened some and exhausted others. The aircraft demanded this price silently, offering no reassurance beyond performance. To fly it well was to accept fear as part of the mission. By 1943, the contradiction was complete. The fighter remained agile, fast, and dangerous, but it could no longer protect the men who flew it. The burden had shifted entirely onto human skill, and skill alone could not alter the balance of a long war. And as crews continued to adapt in the air, a different kind of adaptation was already underway elsewhere, because beyond the combat zones, engineers on the other side were designing aircraft that assumed they would be hit and intended to keep flying anyway. The shock did not come all at once. It arrived through patterns, through repetition. Allied pilots began to learn exactly where to aim. Combat reports, once filled with confusion and admiration, grew precise. They spoke of fuel tanks that burned instead of sealing, of wings that failed under concentrated fire, of cockpits that offered no margin for survival. What had once seemed mysterious was now measurable. The aircraft's strengths were no longer abstract advantages. They were clues. Ironically, those very strengths exposed its weaknesses. To achieve its extraordinary range and maneuverability, the aircraft had sacrificed protection in predictable places. Light wing structures, unarmored cockpits, and vulnerable fuel systems were not hidden flaws, they were structural necessities. Once opponents understood this, tactics adjusted accordingly. Pilots no longer chased turning contests. They aimed deliberately, attacked briefly, and withdrew. Knowledge replaced fear. The struggle that followed was one of arithmetic as much as combat. Losses began to accelerate beyond Japan's capacity to replace them. Aircraft production could not keep pace with attrition. More critically, experienced pilots, men whose skill had once compensated for design, were disappearing faster than they could be trained. Each loss carried a weight greater than numbers suggested. Experience, once concentrated, began to thin. Air engagements reflected this imbalance. Battles that once favored Japanese formations now ended inconclusively or in retreat. The aircraft could still outmaneuver many opponents, but maneuverability alone could not compensate for sustained firepower and coordinated tactics. Encounters grew shorter, harsher, and more decisive. The sky no longer belonged to speed, it belonged to systems. This marked the turning point. Air superiority did not vanish overnight, but it shifted. Allied aircraft appeared in greater numbers, flying with confidence that had once been absent. They absorbed damage and returned. They learned, adapted, and pressed their advantage. The Zero remained dangerous, but it was no longer dominant. Its presence inspired caution, not paralysis. For Japanese crews, the change was deeply unsettling. Trust between pilot and machine, never openly discussed, began to fracture. Pilots knew what the aircraft could do, but they also knew what it could not endure. Each mission carried doubt alongside duty. Could skill still compensate? Could speed still save them? The answers grew less certain with every loss. The aircraft had not changed, but the context had. It was now being asked to survive in a war that demanded resilience as much as brilliance. The machine had been designed for a moment, not a process. When that moment passed, its limitations became unavoidable. Pilots flew on, but belief, the quiet confidence that once accompanied them, had eroded. This breakdown of trust had consequences beyond tactics. Morale suffered not from fear of the enemy, but from awareness of exposure. The aircraft no longer felt like an extension of the pilot's will. It felt like a gamble. Crews understood that survival depended increasingly on circumstances beyond their control. Precision could delay fate, but it could not always outrun it. By the time this reality settled in, the balance of the air war had already shifted. The enemy had learned, adapted, and moved forward. The aircraft that once defined the opening of the Pacific War now found itself defined by its inability to evolve quickly enough. And as the skies filled with newer, heavier machines designed to endure punishment, the Zero's greatest achievement became its greatest liability. Because in a war of learning, the side that adapts fastest decides the future. As the war turned against Japan, belief gave way to urgency. Engineers and commanders alike searched for ways to reinforce the aircraft without sacrificing its defining qualities. Armor plating was reconsidered. Self-sealing fuel tanks were tested. Incremental improvements were proposed in the hope that the design could be carried forward into a new phase of the war. The assumption was simple. The aircraft had been brilliant once, and with care, it might be made sufficient again. The shock came in the results. Even modest additions of weight produced immediate and disproportionate losses in performance. Climb rates fell. Range contracted. The turning advantage so central to the aircraft's identity began to erode. Each attempt at reinforcement undermined the very attributes that had justified the aircraft's existence. There was no hidden reserve, no surplus capacity waiting to be unlocked. The design had been tuned too finely. Here lay the deeper irony. The aircraft's elegance had come from absolute optimization, not adaptability. It had been built for a narrow set of assumptions: short wars, elite pilots, and uncontested initiative. Within those boundaries, it excelled. Outside them, it struggled. Unlike newer Allied fighters, which could absorb additional armor and firepower without losing their core effectiveness, this design had no margin for evolution. Improvement and identity could not coexist. The struggle that followed was one of necessity rather than choice. Crews continued to fly machines that belonged to an earlier phase of the war, facing opponents equipped with heavier weapons, better protection, and increasing numerical advantage. Pilots adapted tactics and accepted risk, but the imbalance was structural. Skill could narrow the gap, but it could not close it. The aircraft was being asked to perform beyond the limits it had been designed to endure. This placed an additional burden on those who flew it. They were not only fighting the enemy, they were compensating for history. Each mission required navigating a landscape that had outgrown their equipment. Losses mounted, not because pilots lacked ability, but because the machine could no longer meet the demands placed upon it. The aircraft had not aged poorly, it had aged exactly as its philosophy predicted. The revelation was unavoidable. The weapon was trapped by the ideas that created it. Its pursuit of perfection had left no room for growth. Where others could adapt through iteration, this design had reached its apex at birth. To change it fundamentally would be to abandon what made it exceptional in the first place. In trying to be everything at the outset, it had left nothing in reserve. By late 1943, the gap between intention and reality was stark. The aircraft still flew, still fought, and still inspired respect in capable hands. But it no longer shaped the battlefield. It reacted to it. The war had become one of production, resilience, and cumulative advantage qualities the design had never been meant to embody. In this sense, the aircraft stands as a lesson written in aluminum and fuel. It demonstrates the danger of building a weapon too perfectly for a world that does not remain still. What had once been a prophecy of dominance had become a constraint, binding its users to a past that could not be reclaimed. And as the war pressed on, the question was no longer whether the aircraft could be improved, but whether Japan could afford to keep fighting a modern war with a machine that could not grow with it. The moment belief failed did not arrive with a single battle or announcement. It unfolded gradually, as losses accumulated and confidence eroded. Squadrons that had once flown with expectation now launched with apprehension. Familiar faces disappeared from briefings. Empty bunks multiplied. Morale collapsed not because pilots lost courage, but because the pattern became undeniable. The cost of flying was rising faster than the war could justify. There was bitter irony in the transformation. A weapon once feared across the Pacific had become a liability to those who relied upon it. The aircraft could still kill, still outmaneuver, still surprise, but these qualities no longer guaranteed survival. Its reputation lingered longer than its effectiveness. Pilots carried the weight of that reputation into combat, only to find that it no longer protected them. Fear had changed sides. This shift altered behavior in the air. Aggression, once celebrated as the highest virtue, began to yield to caution. Survival outweighed initiative. Pilots disengaged sooner. They avoided unnecessary encounters. Missions were completed with restraint rather than dominance. This was not cowardice. It was calculation. The aircraft no longer forgave risk, and crews adjusted accordingly. To return alive became its own measure of success. The turning point lay not in tactics, but in trust. Pilots no longer trusted that doctrine aligned with reality. They understood that the philosophy which had armed them had failed to evolve alongside the war. The assumption that skill could substitute indefinitely for protection had proven false. Doctrine had asked too much of individuals, placing responsibility for survival entirely on human perfection. War, indifferent to perfection, exposed the flaw. This realization carried moral weight. The aircraft had been presented as an extension of national confidence, a symbol of superiority through discipline and resolve. But by 1943 and beyond, that symbol demanded sacrifice without offering security. Crews flew knowing that they were paying for decisions made years earlier, under assumptions that no longer held. The burden was no longer shared evenly between machine and man. Losses reinforced the lesson daily. Even experienced pilots fell to brief encounters, to unseen fire, to circumstances no amount of training could fully control. Each death undercut the remaining faith. Conversations changed tone. Praise for the aircraft grew quieter, more conditional. Admiration was replaced by realism. The men still did their duty, but belief, once instinctive, had fractured. The failure was not mechanical alone. It was philosophical. Doctrine had promised that the right ideas could overcome material limits. It had elevated speed and aggression above protection and endurance. In doing so, it had produced a weapon perfectly suited to a moment that passed too quickly. When the war demanded adaptation, the doctrine and the aircraft it shaped could not answer fully. By the time this was openly acknowledged, the damage was irreversible. Crews continued to fly, but without illusion. The aircraft was no longer trusted to carry them through error or chance. It was treated with respect, even affection, but no longer with faith. Pilots knew that survival depended as much on fortune as on skill. This was the true cost of being untouchable once touch finally came. Belief shattered completely. The Zero had not betrayed its pilots. It had remained true to what it was. But the ideas that created it had failed to protect the men who bore its consequences. And as the war ground on, with newer machines filling the skies and numbers overwhelming skill, Japan confronted a final reckoning, because when belief collapses, no amount of speed can restore it. By the later years of the war, production continued out of necessity rather than confidence. Factories turned out aircraft in growing numbers, even as resources dwindled and airfields shrank under pressure. The logic was simple and desperate. More machines might compensate for mounting losses. Yet the returns diminished with every month. Aircraft left assembly lines only to vanish over the front with increasing speed. Quantity rose, but effectiveness did not follow. The irony was unmistakable. There were more fighters available, but fewer veterans to fly them. The men who had mastered the aircraft's unforgiving demands, who knew how to survive without armor, were disappearing faster than replacements could be prepared. Training programs shortened. Flight hours were reduced. New pilots entered combat with technical familiarity but little experience. The aircraft, once forgiving only to the best, now demanded perfection from those least equipped to provide it. This imbalance marked a turning point. Experience, the single factor that had once compensated for structural weakness, was being lost faster than it could be replaced. Each veteran killed took with him not only skill, but instruction, mentorship, and institutional memory. Squadrons thinned, not just in numbers, but in knowledge. The aircraft's design, which relied on elite handling to mitigate risk, became increasingly incompatible with the reality of mass mobilization. Combat reflected this shift brutally. Inexperienced pilots could not fully exploit the aircraft's strengths, nor could they consistently avoid its weaknesses. Mistakes multiplied. Losses accelerated. The machine that had once amplified expertise now exposed inexperience. It was not designed to teach survival. It assumed it. As a result, the gap between design intent and operational reality widened beyond repair. Attempts to bridge this gap through numbers only deepened the problem. More aircraft meant more crews, but not more time. The pace of war allowed little opportunity for gradual mastery. New pilots learned under fire, often without the chance to adapt. Each loss reinforced the cycle, further reducing the pool of experience available to train the next wave. Production sustained the appearance of resistance, but not its substance. The revelation was stark. The aircraft did not merely fail to prevent defeat, it accelerated it. By consuming experienced pilots at a rate the system could not absorb, it undermined the very foundation of effective air power. Other designs absorbed damage and preserved crews, allowing experience to accumulate over time. This one did not. Its philosophy transformed losses into permanent setbacks. By this stage, the aircraft's reputation no longer intimidated the enemy. Allied pilots engaged with confidence, knowing that even a brief exchange could be decisive. The balance of air power was no longer contested through individual encounters, but through sustained pressure. Numbers now favored those whose machines preserved lives, not those that demanded perfection. In this context, production became a grim arithmetic. Each aircraft represented material effort without corresponding strategic return. Each new pilot represented potential experience that would likely never mature. The system fed itself forward, even as its outcomes worsened. What had once been a symbol of efficiency now revealed itself as an engine of attrition. The final lesson was not technological alone, but human. Air power is built not merely on machines, but on the accumulation of skill over time. A design that sacrifices survivability, sacrifices continuity. In doing so, it forfeits the future. And as the factories continued their work and the skies filled with newer enemy aircraft, the question became unavoidable: how long can a war be fought when experience is expended faster than it is created? By the time the later stages of the air war unfolded, the shock was unmistakable. Japanese pilots encountered enemy aircraft that absorbed damage and kept flying. Rounds that would have ignited fuel or severed control surfaces in earlier battles now struck armor, shattered against reinforced frames, or tore into self-sealing tanks that did not burn. Enemy fighters returned to base trailing smoke, patched and flown again. Survival, once assumed to be secondary, had become decisive. This reversal carried a deep irony. The very elements dismissed years earlier, armor, redundancy, structural strength, were now determining outcomes. Protection did not slow these aircraft into irrelevance. It enabled persistence. Pilots could take hits, make mistakes, and still return. Experience accumulated rather than vanished. What Japanese doctrine had treated as excess weight proved to be a form of endurance no amount of agility could replace. Encounters grew increasingly one-sided. Japanese aircraft still found moments of advantage, still exploited speed when circumstances allowed, but the exchange rate had changed. Enemy pilots pressed attacks, knowing they could survive return fire. They stayed in fights longer. They forced engagements on unfavorable terms. Each clash became a test not of elegance, but of resilience, and resilience consistently prevailed. This marked the permanent turning point. Air superiority no longer shifted back and forth. It tilted and stayed tilted. The skies filled with aircraft designed not for brief dominance, but for sustained pressure. Japanese pilots faced opponents who could afford attrition, who learned through survival rather than sacrifice. The war in the air ceased to be a contest of individual mastery and became a contest of systems. Lightness, once celebrated as brilliance, now revealed its fatal cost. The aircraft's defining quality, its extreme weight savings, meant there was nothing left to give when struck. Damage translated immediately into loss. There was no gradual failure, no chance to limp home. The machine performed perfectly or not at all. Against an enemy that could endure partial failure, perfection was an impossible requirement. The revelation cut deeper than technology. It exposed the final flaw in the philosophy that had shaped the aircraft from the beginning. War was not decided by who flew best in ideal conditions, but by who remained capable when conditions deteriorated. Protection did not negate skill. It preserved it. By allowing pilots to survive error and chance, it multiplied experience over time. Lightness did the opposite. It consumed it. Pilots understood this intuitively as the war progressed. They watched enemy aircraft take punishment and continue. They saw their own machines fail instantly under similar circumstances. The comparison required no explanation. Confidence drained not because courage faltered, but because outcomes became predictable. The aircraft had not become worse. The war had simply moved beyond what it was built to fight. By this stage, no modification could reverse the imbalance. Even improved variants could not erase the original trade-offs. The design remained bound to its founding assumptions, unable to cross the threshold into survivability without losing its identity entirely. Meanwhile, the enemy's machines evolved steadily, carrying more protection, more firepower, and more pilots who lived to fight again. The air war now reflected time itself as a weapon. Each month favored the side whose pilots returned, learned, and accumulated. Each loss on the Japanese side erased years of investment. The aircraft's lightness accelerated this erosion. What once promised decisive advantage now ensured irreversible decline. In the end, the aircraft was not defeated by a single enemy model or tactic. It was outclassed by time. Built for a swift war that never ended, It faced a reality it could not endure. Lightness had delivered early dominance, but endurance decided the outcome. And as the skies filled with machines designed to survive tomorrow as well as today, the final lesson became unavoidable, because in modern war, the ability to keep flying matters more than how perfectly one flies at the start. As the war moved toward its final phase, the consequences of early design choices became impossible to separate from strategic outcomes. Losses mounted not only in individual engagements, but across entire campaigns. Airfields were abandoned. Convoys went unprotected. Operations once planned with confidence were scaled back or canceled outright. The erosion of air power no longer appeared as a series of unfortunate events. It had become a defining condition of the war. What made this collapse especially stark was its origin. The aircraft had been built to dominate the skies, to deliver decisive advantage at the outset of conflict, and it had done exactly that. But the same qualities that produced early superiority now accelerated decline. Speed and range, once liberating, could not compensate for the steady loss of pilots. Maneuverability, once overwhelming, could not prevent attrition. A weapon designed to win quickly now prolonged defeat by exhausting the very resources it depended upon. Here, the irony reached its fullest expression. Dominance had created dependency. Doctrine had shaped engineering, and engineering had shaped behavior. Because the aircraft demanded perfection, it rewarded only the most skilled and consumed them just as efficiently. Strategic losses followed inevitably. Air superiority faded. Ground forces advanced without cover. Naval operations faced increasing risk. The decline of the fighter rippled outward, affecting decisions far beyond the cockpit. This was not failure in the conventional sense. The aircraft did not malfunction. It did not betray expectations. It performed exactly as it was designed to perform. That was the problem. Its excellence was conditional, bounded by assumptions that no longer applied. When the war expanded beyond those assumptions, when it demanded endurance, replacement, and survival, the design could not follow. Strategy paid the price for precision. The revelation, clear in hindsight, is that engineering choices are never isolated. They encode beliefs about the future. In this case, the belief was that war would be short, decisive, and won through initiative. Every rivet, every omission reflected that confidence. When reality diverged, the aircraft could not adapt fast enough to bridge the gap. What had once been foresight became inertia. As losses mounted, Japan faced not only material shortages, but conceptual ones. New designs arrived too late or inherited the same constraints. Training pipelines could not restore experience quickly enough. The strategic balance, once delicately held, tipped irreversibly. The aircraft that had symbolized innovation now represented limitation. Its presence reminded commanders of what had been gained and what had been lost. In this sense, design became destiny. The aircraft shaped the opening of the war and constrained its continuation. It influenced tactics, training, production, and morale. Each of these, in turn, fed back into strategic outcomes. The chain was unbroken. There was no single moment of collapse, only a steady convergence toward inevitability. This does not diminish the courage of those who flew it. Pilots adapted, endured, and fought with determination long after advantages had faded. Their experience underscores the human cost of abstract decisions. Engineering philosophies, once translated into metal and fuel, become lived realities. They decide who returns and who does not. They shape not just battles, but lives. By the war's end, the lesson stood in stark relief. Weapons built for dominance must also be built for duration. A machine optimized for perfection in a fleeting moment risks becoming a liability when the moment passes. The aircraft had been a masterpiece of its time, but time itself became its adversary. And in that quiet reckoning, the final truth emerged. When design reflects belief more than reality, belief may carry a nation into war, but design determines how it endures it. Long after the war, the pilots who survived spoke with a clarity that had once been impossible. Their accounts were not dramatic. They did not exaggerate. They described fear plainly, as a constant companion rather than a momentary weakness. They spoke of skill honed to its limits, and of resignation that arrived not as despair, but as understanding. These men had lived inside the aircraft's promise and its cost. From the beginning, many had known, not in abstract terms, but in sensation. They felt it in the thinness of the cockpit walls, in the way rounds passed through where armor should have been, in the immediacy with which damage became fatal. Flying the aircraft required absolute attention. There was no room for error, no tolerance for chance. Pilots understood this intuitively, even when official language avoided it. The irony is that those closest to the machine understood its limits best. Crews spoke quietly among themselves about fragility, about how survival depended more on avoidance than engagement. They adjusted tactics before doctrine did. They learned when to disengage, when to refuse combat, when to accept that discretion preserved life better than courage alone. These lessons were earned, not taught. Yet this understanding rarely traveled upward. Command remained committed to the idea that performance outweighed protection, that spirit could compensate for structure. From a distance, the aircraft still looked exceptional. From inside it, the reality was more fragile. Pilots lived between these perspectives, expected to embody confidence while privately managing risk. The gap between belief and experience widened with every mission. Survivors recalled the erosion of trust, not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual recalibration. At first, faith in the aircraft remained strong. Its agility inspired confidence. Its victories reinforced belief. But as losses mounted, trust shifted from the machine to the pilot's own judgment. The aircraft became something to manage carefully rather than rely upon fully. This distinction mattered. Trust, once broken, changes behavior permanently. Fear entered not as panic, but as awareness. Pilots learned to respect the aircraft's limits because ignoring them meant death. They spoke of flying lighter, faster, always scanning for escape. Every sound, every vibration carried meaning. Combat demanded restraint as much as aggression. To survive was to remain constantly aware that the machine beneath them offered no second chances. What these men expressed most clearly was not bitterness, but realism. They did not blame the aircraft for being what it was. Many still admired it deeply. They blamed the assumptions that had shaped it, the belief that wars could be won quickly, that excellence in one dimension excused absence in another. The aircraft reflected those ideas faithfully. The pilots bore their consequences. In this way, the human element reveals the final lesson. Performance alone is not enough. A machine must earn the trust of those who rely upon it, not only through capability, but through protection. Trust allows pilots to fight boldly without calculation, overwhelming instinct. When that trust erodes, survival becomes the priority, and initiative fades. This shift, subtle but decisive, shapes outcomes more than statistics suggest. The pilots knew all along because they had no choice but to know. Their lives depended on it. They adapted faster than doctrine, learned faster than design, and endured longer than belief allowed. Their testimony does not diminish the aircraft's historical significance, it completes it. Because in the end, wars are not fought by concepts or blueprints. They are fought by people, making decisions under pressure, trusting the tools they are given. When that trust is misplaced, no amount of performance can restore it. And in the quiet words of those who survived, one truth remains unmistakable. Machines may define capability, but trust defines how long that capability can be sustained. In the end, the story resolves not as a technical failure, but as a moral one. The aircraft was built to strike first, to arrive faster, turn tighter, and reach farther than anything before it. In that narrow purpose, it succeeded brilliantly. But survival was treated as optional, almost indulgent. The assumption was that war would reward initiative so completely that endurance would never be tested. History rarely honors such assumptions. Likeness, once celebrated as genius, became a curse because it reflected overconfidence elevated into doctrine. Engineers did not merely design an aircraft. They encoded a belief system into aluminum and fuel. Every omission of armor, every sacrifice safeguard, spoke to faith in speed and skill as substitutes for resilience. This was not ignorance. It was conviction. And conviction, when unchallenged, hardens quickly. The aircraft's early success reinforced that confidence at precisely the wrong moment. Victories appeared to validate the philosophy behind it, delaying reassessment and discouraging adaptation. What should have been a warning phase became a confirmation loop. By the time reality intruded through losses, attrition, and enemy learning, the design had no room left to change. Innovation had been exhausted at the outset. This is where doctrine proved blinding. By committing fully to one vision of war, alternatives were dismissed as unnecessary or even counterproductive. Protection was framed as weakness, redundancy was seen as waste. The possibility of a long, grinding conflict was acknowledged abstractly, but never allowed to shape design in a meaningful way. The aircraft was optimized for belief, not uncertainty. As the war evolved, the cost of that rigidity multiplied. Each loss carried consequences beyond numbers. Pilots did not merely die, experience vanished with them. Units did not merely shrink, knowledge eroded. Lightness magnified this effect by ensuring that damage translated quickly into death. What might have been recoverable elsewhere became final here. The aircraft accelerated attrition not because it was inferior, but because it was unforgiving. In contrast, enemy designs reflected a different moral calculus. They assumed imperfection. They accepted that pilots would be hit, would make mistakes, would survive to learn. Armor and redundancy were not admissions of weakness, but acknowledgments of reality. These machines aged with the war, growing heavier, stronger, and more capable as demands increased. They did not need to be perfect, they needed to endure. The curse of lightness, then, was not that it failed, but that it left no margin for change. It demanded excellence forever, in a world that guarantees none. Once the skies filled with aircraft designed for survival, the earlier brilliance of speed alone could no longer decide outcomes. Time favored those who could absorb loss and continue. The aircraft could not. This does not diminish its place in history. For a moment, it redefined aerial combat. It forced enemies to rethink tactics and accelerate innovation. It shaped the opening of a global war. But its legacy is inseparable from its limitation. It stands as a reminder that weapons are arguments about the future, and that arguments based on certainty rarely age well. In the quiet reckoning that followed, the lesson became clear. War rewards not just those who strike first, but those who remain when the first strike no longer decides everything. Design choices, once made, echo long after belief fades. They determine who adapts and who is trapped by their own success. They built it to strike first and forgot it had to survive. It ruled the sky briefly. Then, the sky turned against it.